Welcome to another episode of Outside Ourselves. I'm your host, Kelsi Klimbera. Today, I am chatting with my friend, Amy Mantravadi. Amy is a contributor to the 1517 website. I am fortunate enough to be able to edit some of her amazing articles. But today, we are specifically talking about her new historical fiction novel called Broken Bonds. This novel was just released by 1517 last month. Amy's story focuses on the debate between Martin Luther and Erasmus over whether or not we have free will when it comes to salvation. She has taken this story and written a gripping novel, which also includes the character of Philip Melanchthon, who is, of course, Martin Luther's right-hand man within the Reformation. Today we talk a little bit about her process, also her theological journey, how she kind of discovered the theology of the Reformation and became fascinated with the characters. And then there's even a little bit about the beauty of justification, the need not only for Christ's death on the cross, but his resurrection. Amy does an amazing job of kind of declaring and proclaiming the gospel in this episode. So I know that you are in for a treat with what Amy has to say. With that, here is today's episode. Hey, Amy, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Well, it's great to see you, Kelsi, on the internet after seeing you in person not long ago, but this will have to make do.
I know. I was bummed. I really wanted to make it work to have an in-person interview at when we were together at Here We Still Stand, but I knew, because I always try to pack that weekend full of stuff, and I knew if I added one more thing, it just would not do this interview justice. So I wish it had happened, but I hope this is for the best. I think it's going to be.
I think you definitely made the right call, because now that I've actually been to a Here We Still Stand conference and seen how hard you all party, I think definitely it was best not to try to do it.
Wrong idea, Amy. But you can also talk it up a little bit, because it's pretty safe, clean fun. Is that what you would say?
So the truth, dear listeners, is that I think I went to bed at 9 p.m. every night. But I will say, for anyone who has not attended a Here We Still Stand, that I walked away very encouraged. I thought it was just a great time, and I felt like I was around people who cared about me and who were gracious. And I walked away feeling confident about the future of the church, which was the theme of the conference. So
that's all encouraging. Yeah, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, we are here today to talk about this book that we've already mentioned, that you've done such an amazing job writing it, and now you're working so hard to promote it and get it into people's hands. So I want to dive into that. But first, I really want to hear a little bit about you. And I want you to introduce yourself to listeners, and then probably follow up with some questions. So who are you, Amy Mantravadi? What do you do? Where do you live? Tell us all about who you are.
So the usual biography that is provided for me is that I live in Dayton, Ohio, with my husband and our son, Thomas. A little more background on that. We ended up in Dayton, Ohio, because my husband was in the Air Force for 15 years. Okay. He got early retirement, and there's a major Air Force base here. So this was his last assignment, and then we just decided to stay here. And it's it's a nice area to live, and we have a nice church home here that we really love, and they have a really special ministry to children and adults with special needs, and our son does have some of those. So that a big part of my life, a lot of my time is taking my son to school. He has various therapy appointments, things like that. But when he is doing those things, I have some time to write. So I write theological essays for 1517 on Substack, and then I contribute sometimes to other places like Modern Reformation or places like that. And then I write these historical fiction novels, which really, if you take a look at my CV and what I studied at school, you will not see much of anything that would lend you to think that I would end up as a historical fiction novelist.
Yeah.
And what the listeners might like to know there is that my undergrad was at Taylor University in Indiana, which is a broadly evangelical school. I studied biblical literature there. I was one of only 2 females who were doing that as a major. So you could say either the odds were against us or very much in our favor, depending on your point of view. And also did a political science major there. And I was thinking that political science was the career track I was going to take. So I did my master's degree in international security, which is basically international relations focusing on security issues. And I got a job working for the press office of the Egyptian government in Washington, D.C. So for 4 years, I was on the payroll of the Egyptians, which is probably the single fact about me that most astounds people and still kind of astounds me. And all I can say is there was a big economic crisis at the time, and you could not be choosy about the jobs that you took. So, but basically, never been to Egypt, don't speak Arabic, but I knew a lot about the U.S. Political situation, and I had studied the Middle East a lot in school. That's because a lot of the security issues at the time were happening in the Middle East, and still are. So that was an interesting 4 years of my life, because they had, well, some people call it a revolution, other people just call it like an uprising, but basically they had a big change of government while I was there. And I spent a few days with, we were, of all the Egyptian embassies on planet Earth that were had anyone speaking English, our office was the only one that was answering the phone, because everyone else was just like, I don't want to talk to the press. So I was getting interview requests from every major news outlet in the Western world. And it was just a crazy couple days. But yeah.
That is crazy.
Yeah. And you know what the Lord told me through 4 years of focusing on the Middle East and politics? He taught me something about the depravity of man, really. And both of the possibilities of politics, but more importantly, of the things that politics absolutely cannot do. And just these intractable issues we see, because really what we ultimately need is the gospel and not just a political ideology. Now, politics has a role to play in sort of, you could say, restraining wickedness and promoting, a better way of life for us here. And I know you've recently done a couple episodes, wonderful episodes with Bruce Hellman and Adam Francisco talking about this. But that time, really, God was taking me from, I'd grown up with this version of Christianity that was sort of, some people call it decision theology. It's really like you're making a decision for Christ, and you just need to have enough faith and place your faith in that. And, if taken the right way, that's not necessarily going to put you down a terrible path. But for me, being a person who's very introspective and analytical, that led to me just stewing and really worrying. And well into my 20s, I was very convinced that salvation was a free will thing. I consider myself an Arminian. I went to a Wesleyan church while I was in college. And that experience of actually having to confront what human beings are really like, I think, in such a major way, was God starting to prepare the groundwork for me when I would come in contact with the theology of Martin Luther and the Reformation, and understanding that actually absent the work of God, the will is bound to sin. And that's why you're seeing these intractable problems, because people can't actually really improve their behavior all that much.
Right.
And it just sort of, it all started to, I think it ultimately, it was a hard thing for me to accept, but one thing that made it easier for me to ultimately accept was that I just seen the evidence so clearly in front of my face from my life
Yeah,
experiences.
I feel like that's what I hear more times than not is, and you know, mocking our friends at Mockingbird are so good at about this. Like Dave Zoll talks about this all the time. Is it's like this is in scripture, but like you also can just look around and
Yeah.
talk to people about their experiences, and pretty quickly, if people are willing to be honest with themselves and about the world around them, you see that human beings are very limited in what we're capable of. And while it's nice to have it seems like at first it's nice to have a philosophy of a high anthropology and being very optimistic about what we can do in this sort of political sphere, or just what the law can even do, you know, like what the law promises to do, thinking like, yeah, we can achieve that. When you look around at history, when you look around at the reality of governments and stuff, I think it's that quickly falls away. And yeah, this idea of low anthropology, or of the bound will, or even total depravity, it is at first like, ugh, that seems terrible. But in the end, it's so freeing. It's so freeing to know, like, wait, this is the only option without God. And yet we have a God who comes in and says, even though you're bound to this, I'm going to free you, and I'm going to do it in my way. So that's amazing. I think, you know, my experience is I worked for nonprofits a lot in my early 20s, like after college, and kind of similar, actually, like you saying that. I don't think I would have maybe said it that way without you saying it first, but that experience, you know, you just hit so many frustration after frustration of not being able to help people, of the people, realizing the people you work with, and I think this is true for ministry as well, are so much more sinful and um, you know, let you down a lot more than you would hope. I think that experience kind of is a good primer for confronting this theology and being like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense given my experience. Can you talk a little bit about like what was this encounter with Reformation theology like for you? When did that kind of happen? I mean, I know you've always loved history. Was it kind of through that route? Were you just reading a lot? I'm curious about how that shift kind of started to happen for you.
Well, as is so often the case, it kind of came out of a bit of a wilderness period in my life. The Lord had literally called me out of Egypt because I had married my husband and we had to move away from Washington, D.C., where we were living. So
Okay.
I had been thinking I would even go on and like get my PhD in that field and
Hmm.
try to go beyond, but God kind of closed every door, and the biggest one he closed was just moving us to Dayton, Ohio, where there really
Hmm.
weren't any jobs in my field. And so I had to say, well, what am I going to do? And so I did a couple things. First, I took a job with the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center doing social science research because I thought, well, that's sort of close to my field. And they were having me drive all over the place in this whole
Hmm.
region to interview people at their homes. And
Hmm.
so I was having to find things to do in the car while I was traveling. Simultaneously, I don't know what possessed me to think this, but I thought, well, if I'm ever going to write a novel, now would be the time to do it because I'm kind of in between things. We don't
Hmm.
have any children, just do it now. And I had the idea to write these novels that took place in medieval times. So those two things came together, and that I listened to a course on medieval Christianity while I was in the car. And that
Hmm.
was pretty good. But then I went on and it like you could continue onto the course on the Reformation. And once I continued on to that, it kind of, it just lit a fire under me because I had known, a little bit about the Reformation, sort
Yeah.
of what generically you might know as
Hmm.
an evangelical Christian. And I knew a little bit about Luther, but I really didn't know much about his developed theology or the history of his life. Um, and interestingly, I did know a little bit about Erasmus, one of the other characters in my book, because in
Oh,
biblical
interesting.
literature, we learned about him being this person who had revolutionized Bible translation. So
Yeah.
I knew about Erasmus, but I had
Okay.
no idea that he had gotten into a feud with Martin Luther or why they would be in a feud with each other. So basically two presentations in that course stood out to me. The first was the one on Luther's 1518 Heidelberg Disputation.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have ever read that or, heard it described, basically he works through a series of points that each build on the other and on the previous one. And when he gets to the very end, he says, the love of God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to it. The love of man comes into being through that which is pleasing to it. Basically, that the way God loves is different from the way that human beings love. It's kind of counterintuitive in that way. And as soon as I heard this phrase, I immediately had this internal reaction, oh, that's true. That's absolutely biblical. And then with my very next breath, I was like, oh no, because I followed it. My brain had immediately followed that all the way to its logical end. And I said, well, if that is true, then what that means is that we don't actually have free will in regard to salvation.
Can you work that out for people just a little bit more who might be a little unfamiliar with that?
Let me explain what my brain did in those 5 seconds or so, if I can remember. So basically, what it's saying is that God is not loving you because he is finding anything in you that is pleasing to him. He's not loving you because you've done good works. He's not loving you because you have so much faith that you are actually so, this is something Luther will say elsewhere. Basically, you're so dead in your sins. It's not just that you're dirty and need to be washed in baptism. That's not what's happening, just that you're getting some dirt washed off you. You're dead and you need to be resurrected. That's, this is what happens when Christ seizes you. And that was, another thing that had happened around that time in my life is that the church I grew up in was experiencing a lot of discord. And I had heard, and I don't want to assign this to any person because I'm not looking to call anyone out, but I had heard that someone had said as part of that you don't forgive someone unless they've repented of their sin. And which to me, like the other thing, that thing Luther said, it immediately seemed right. That when I heard it immediately seemed wrong. And I said, well, why is that wrong? And I thought, well, because of that verse in Romans where it says that basically God demonstrated his love to us and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It's God who's taking the initiative. So when Luther says the love of God does not find but creates what is pleasing to it, he's saying God is making you righteous. God is giving you faith. Everything that pertains to salvation, God is giving it to you as a gracious gift. It's not anything you're working up in yourself. And, I hadn't thought that salvation was by works because I knew that was the Catholic position. So I knew that was wrong.
Right.
But I hadn't thought of having faith as a work. And yet I was constantly experiencing this lack of assurance because I'm like, oh, my faith isn't good enough. Did I really have faith all those years ago?
Right.
Or did I just think I had faith?
Yeah.
I was saying it wasn't a work, and yet the way I was acting was like it was a work that I was having to do.
Yeah.
So, and basically what Luther's saying is, guess what? You didn't have faith because you were so smart and made the right choice. Because look, people aren't making the right choices. If you can't make the right choice to obey God on all these other occasions, why are you going to make it on that occasion? It's just you're not going to suddenly become that way. And so, but what that means, of course, is that if it's God who's totally responsible for our salvation, then he's completely sovereign over who has salvation. And of course, because the only form of predestination I'd really been exposed to was a very hardened Calvinism where it's like God, wants to send, most people he's like
Yeah.
damning them now, which
hmm
Luther is not going to deny that, at the end of time, there are going to be people who haven't accepted Christ, who haven't been saved. But he's saying it gave me this sort of positive view of things, whereas
Right.
I'd only
Yeah.
ever had it presented negatively before. And to be fair, presented by people who weren't even Calvinists, who didn't accept that kind of
Mm.
theology. So they probably were putting it in the most negative way possible. But
Right. Yeah.
that's sort of so I after I listened to that lecture, I'm like, I'm getting pushed. I'm very uncomfortable at this point because I really don't want to change my mind, but I feel like I'm getting pushed. Then we move on to another lecture, which is on the feud between Luther and Erasmus. And this came about because by this point, Luther's been excommunicated by the Pope. The emperor has pronounced the sentence of death against him. And this whole time, Luther's refusing to recant. So now we're at an impasse because the Pope doesn't have an army that can go get him. The emperor is too busy trying to fight off the Turks to go get him.
Yeah.
So
They're busy.
yeah. So because the governor of Luther's particular region of Saxony is sort of well disposed toward him, he's safe there for the time being. So now what's going to happen is the people who are still loyal to Rome are going to say, well, we just need someone to prove that his argument is bunk. And they look to the best-selling, most famed Catholic scholar of the day, who was Erasmus. Unfortunately, Erasmus was not really a trained theologian, which is not to say he didn't have any theological training, but he was mainly working as a translator, as someone explaining the Greek and Latin classics. He did do the translation of the Bible, but he wasn't a biblical theologian. He did that translation of the Bible because he was translating all kinds of ancient documents, and what could be more great of an ancient document than the Bible? So Erasmus's real gift is for biting humor, and they come to him and want him to write a very serious, in-depth theological treatise that will be such a powerful argument that it will just put to bed all this Lutheran stuff forever. And first of all, Erasmus feels like he can't do that, and if you read his letters at the time, he's saying, all this is going to do is make everyone mad at me. This is terrible. I don't want to do this. He was kicking and screaming. But basically, King Henry VIII of England, that guy with all the wives, he was writing to Erasmus, and Erasmus was depending on all these great politicians for his patronage. He didn't have any salary of his own. He was just living on the goodwill of others, moving from place to place. So as King Henry VIII's wives learned, when he tells you to do something, you better do it. So that's what happened with Erasmus. And we think, I mean, as far as I could tell, it was Erasmus's own idea that free will would be the issue that they would debate, because, he had looked at everything Luther had been talking about, and there'd be these controversies over indulgences and papal councils and whether they were authoritative and all these different things. But the one thing Luther ever gave Erasmus credit for was he was able to look at all Luther's theology and pick the one critical point.
Yeah,
and it's
the
this
foundation.
Point, yes. And it's this point over whether or not we have free will, specifically free will in regard to salvation, being able to do things that merit salvation. Because Luther believes that, of course, you can have free will to choose what you're going to eat for dinner, even to do some things he would call civic righteousness, like you can choose to be nicer to someone as opposed to nastier, but you can't
He's not
do
a determinist.
Right. So, yeah. So that was how. Yeah.
And it's good to clarify that, because I think nowadays a lot of free will debates are actually about whether, we're living in the matrix and we're puppets and whatever. And so when you bring it up, that's immediately where everyone's mind goes, is like, oh, you're saying I can't choose to wear these shoes or these shoes in the morning, or what you have for dinner, like you said. And so it is a good clarification that when we're talking about this debate in particular, we're talking about you do not have free will, whether or not you have free will in matters of salvation.
Yeah, I mean, a few years ago, I read this little book by Sam Harris. He's one of the new atheists, and
Yeah.
he's a complete, absolute materialist. And he
Mm-hmm.
was arguing that we don't have free will. And he's
Right.
arguing it based on studies they've done of like when you have brain signals versus when you take the actual action. And his theory is that because there's like a gap in this timing, it means that materially we're not actually making the decisions, we're being acted upon by something in our brain to do what we do. And if you are an absolute materialist, I think you have to say that because you think everything has to have a material cause.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it is interesting that
Mm-hmm.
we're now seeing that coming out from people who are atheists. But in terms of, when I first came across this debate, I mean, I said, I need to read these books because I found it really fascinating. Just the interplay of personalities that you have these two scholars who are just so different from each other. And yet it's like fate is bringing them together, I know we're talking, fate's kind of the subject we're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, although, pagan fate is different than what we're talking about from is terms of Christians. But anyway, I'm still going to use the metaphor. So
well, I love it. Go with it.
Yeah. The first thing I did was I read Erasmus's book because I said, I'm not going to read Luther's without first reading what Erasmus had to say. And actually, I thought Erasmus made a lot of good points. And really, Erasmus, if going back and reading it now, it's not that great of a book. He's basically, he's repeating arguments that have been around a long time. It's not novel by any means. But the more interesting thing Erasmus does, besides arguing in favor of free will, is that he basically argues that we can't have absolute certainty about much at all. He's going to make this argument that the scripture is fundamentally unclear about a lot of things. Because he's even going to say, you know what, Luther, maybe you're right, but if you are, we shouldn't be preaching this because then people won't behave, And I can understand why that was a fear for him because people were behaving very poorly at that time. So I understand why, he would be concerned about that. But it's sort of this very non-committal work. And given that he didn't really want to write it in the first place, that maybe isn't surprising. But
that's interesting.
Yeah. And of course, Luther's never been anything less than 110% committed to anything. When he was a monk, he was a 110% monk. And when he left the monastery, he is 110% not going to do that anymore. So so I read Erasmus's book, and then I went through this period of, I was really trying to study it in depth and really absorb it. So it took me a couple months to get through The Bondage of the Will. And if you look at my copy now, it's like all marked up everywhere, all kinds of commentary. And I can actually point you to the particular page where I write at the bottom, like, okay, maybe you're right. And that's basically the point at which he just kind of wore me down. I think not even because any single point was so strong, but it was just like the constant again and again. And I was really convinced also by my own scripture reading in the Gospel of John, in Romans, and in the book of Romans, but probably even more in the Gospel of John. There's a lot there to draw on as well. And I just prayed to God. I said, God, if this is true and you want me to change my opinion, then okay, and so that's what ended up happening. And because I'm a person who, by that point, liked to write novels, my immediate thought was this would make a great novel.
Okay, so you had this idea early, like as far as early into this kind of theological transformation for you. This has been kind of like a linchpin thing.
I had even had this, think it would make a good novel before I had even read their books, based on the story I'd heard in that lecture. Yeah. And I tried to think, what was it about it that so gripped me? Because really, it's just two academics having a fight, and which normally for most of us is not, like not very interesting at all.
Right.
I think I realized it recently. I rewatched the movie Amadeus, which is basically a movie about two intellectuals in a feud. And that movie is just an incredible psychological drama
Mm,
between the two of them, with like divine judgment and all kind of great philosophical themes coming in. And I said, oh my goodness, this is the dynamic.
yeah.
Erasmus is Salieri. He's the person who has the support of the establishment, but he's actually
Mm,
just kind of a so-so theologian.
yeah.
And Luther is Mozart. He's the person who's bringing in all this novel stuff. He's not getting the support of the establishment. People think he's like totally wacky, and he's making lots of poop jokes, because actually Mozart and Luther are probably history's two most famous scatological jokers. So I realize this now. I mean, because that's an incredible film, and I realized I probably in my head at some level was thinking that kind of dynamic, and that's why
really
it appealed to
interesting.
me.
But I'm curious about this whole process, because historical fiction is, it's a little bit, I would say, a niche genre, probably, right? I don't know.
Nerdy,
You
nerdy is the word you're going for there.
Let's go with niche, Amy. I like niche.
Okay.
It sounds
All right.
cool. Yeah, and I'm just I'm curious. In my mind, when I think about it, I'm like, I feel like there might be this tension between historical accuracy and storytelling. And I'm wondering if you've felt that tension, if that's a thing at play, and how you kind of navigate that, or maybe it's something else completely. But tell us a little bit about the process of even writing this book. I'm assuming you're doing a ton of reading ahead of time. What does all of that look like?
Yes, I mean, this is an ongoing debate in historical fiction, how much should be history and how much should be fiction. And
Okay.
historical fiction includes everything from what I'm doing, which is essentially taking a real story and just telling how it happened, and then I have to add some stuff to fill out the story, but
Hmm.
I'm really trying to show you, what historically happened.
Okay.
You can have all that to stories that are just a completely novel plot, but they're set in a historical era.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Gotcha.
that's sort of on the other end of the spectrum. And then you have people like some authors I could mention who are telling stories of real people, but they just change lots of details and add sensational stuff. And some
Okay.
of them get very big book deals and movie deals and stuff. But, to each their own. But I would rather keep it as historically accurate as possible. Every once in a while, you'll have things where it just really, there are some things that get lost translating it into the medium of a novel.
Mm,
But you try to, usually they're very minor things, not big
okay.
details of the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Like for instance, in this book, um, I had done months of research before I started writing. And then as I'm writing, I continue researching the whole time before I write every scene. And I wrote this scene where it's Philip Melanchthon, my third main character, who's Luther's
Hmm.
colleague at the University of Wittenberg. It's in his hometown when he's a child. So it's a flashback scene. And I had him leaving his house and walking to the market square, and it was all very nice. And then it was long after I had read my first draft that I realized that actually his house was in a different location than I had than I had put it in the book.
Oh.
Like it was one
Mm,
street over.
okay.
And but it's hard to describe, but actually for the purposes of that scene, I would have had to tear everything apart and put it back together to change it. And I'm like, okay, it doesn't really matter if his
Mm,
house is in the wrong spot.
yeah.
Like no one who
It's
reads
fine.
this is going to care.
Yeah.
But, there are other things, like if you were to completely get wrong the motivations for why Erasmus is writing his book or why Luther's going to respond to him. I mean, that's a key plot point. So,
You're right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm guessing, is it difficult in your mind to try and capture their personalities? I mean, obviously, we know quite a bit about probably all three of those characters' personalities from letters and different things. Did you find that to be a little bit of a struggle, or is that kind of one of the
Mm.
fun parts?
Well, most parts of the research and writing process are fun. That
Yeah.
the not fun part is like the after all the stuff that comes after that's not writing and research. Pretty much any author is going to tell you that. Um, so yeah, the nice thing about these three characters, as opposed to Empress Matilda, who I'd previously worked on, we have like nothing surviving in her original voice. We have a couple letters from her, but they're very formal legal documents.
Okay.
And so trying to reconstruct her personality was a lot of guesswork.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
sometimes that can be a blessing, because if you don't know
Yeah.
anything, then you don't have to be worrying, oh, some historian is going to figure out that I missed something here, because there's nothing to miss, because nothing exists.
Exactly.
With this book, it was almost the complete opposite. Martin Luther is one of the most researched individuals in human history. Erasmus, very well researched as well. And Melanchthon, pretty well researched. However, the issue with Melanchthon is that when you read Erasmus or Luther's letters, you pretty much can tell right away how they were feeling, and what, like, their personality comes out majorly in what they write. Even in what they published, it comes out. With Melanchthon, he's a much more formal person. He doesn't get real gossipy in his letters. Not that I'm accusing anyone of gossip, but he's not like putting as an addendum, oh, by the way, so-and-so did this and it really annoyed me, whereas you do definitely get that. And
keeping his feelings to himself a little bit more.
Which that in itself demonstrates something to you about his personality.
For sure.
But he was definitely the hardest one to nail down. And I'm sure as people, if you're a person who has spent a lot of time studying the Reformation, either formally or just as a lay person, you're going to have your own opinion of what Luther was like, maybe of what Erasmus was like or Melanchthon was like. So there's the issue. It's kind of like trying to adapt a book into a movie, and all the people who read the book go and see it and they're like, this wasn't what I pictured in my head. It's the same phenomenon. Everybody has their own Luther. And I also know that I don't have the ability to perfectly portray any of the three of them, just because there's information we don't have, and I'm not a perfect person.
Yeah.
So at a certain point, I have to accept that what I'm creating three characters, and these characters bear a lot of resemblance to three historical persons, but are not necessarily exactly the same. And that's okay, because this is not a work of academic history. It's not a biography. You do get a certain amount of leeway with fiction, even if you're trying to be historically accurate, that we understand some things might be a little different than what we would have expected. But I do hope, one thing I really hope with this novel, this has always been a goal of mine, is that the Luther you're going to see here will actually be Lutheran. Because most of the fictional portrayals with him, like if you see the 2003 film, which I'm not saying was a poor film, but and many other accounts about him, they tend to focus a lot on his recovery of central gospel doctrines. You're not going to see him talking about his views of the sacraments or things that are more uniquely Lutheran are not going to be showing up there, because oftentimes those things, they're going for a wide audience. So if they have Luther saying that he thinks anyone who doesn't share his view of the Lord's Supper might, have a different spirit and we're not really sure about them, then, that's going to alienate people. And he alienated a lot of people in his life.
Right.
So, but I was really determined. I mean, this isn't a book that's just trying to alienate people or show all the worst things about Luther, but I really wanted to make sure that he actually is Lutheran and not just a generic evangelical.
An evangelical American Christian of some sort. Yeah. No, that is a good point. I think Robert Cole said this, and he's maybe said it other places, but I think it's in his most recent book. He talks about he's talking about Lutheranism, but of course Luther fits into that, is not, people think he's almost like on this, it's this sliding scale of like Catholic to Protestantism, and he's like kind of in between, but he says it's more like a triangle, that Lutheranism is outside of both of those, and it's not necessarily fair to put them on like a sliding scale. And I think that that's something people miss a lot of times, because we do have some very particular doctrines and views when it comes to, of course, the sacraments, the bound will, predestination. No one, I feel like anytime you hear a general, these are the views on predestination, the Lutheran view is just like left out completely, because people
Well, it's probably the
forget about it or don't
closest
know
to
it.
it's the closest to Saint Augustine's view. So
Yeah.
But yeah, I sometimes have people ask me now, they're like, do you think if Luther was alive today that he could reconcile with the Roman Catholic Church? Because the Catholic Church has changed a lot since Luther's day. And
Right.
I kind of say this quietly, but in a certain sense, the Reformation won, because the Catholic Church has come around to a lot of the key issues in the Reformation, having a vernacular liturgy now allowed in the Catholic Church. The possibility that there could be salvation if you're not in communion with the Bishop of Rome, now acknowledged by the Catholic Church. So we've had a lot of these changes. Technically, you could still get an indulgence in Catholicism, but they do not have this big trade in indulgences. They understand, they agree now that it was a problem.
Yeah.
But what they have not changed, and this is what I tell people, they have not gone back on what they said at the Council of Trent, which happened in the late 1540s, early 1550s.
Right. I was going to say that chief doctrine, they're still a little bit finicky about. Chief doctrine of justification.
They said if anyone says with the certainty of faith that he knows he's justified before God, let him be anathema. Right. And for that one sentence alone, Martin Luther absolutely could not reconcile with the Roman Catholic Church, because that was everything to him.
Right.
So I definitely, in terms of liturgy and things like that, there may be some more. Lutheranism is closer to Catholicism, and certainly is much closer than sort of low church, generic evangelical, non-denominational evangelicalism in the United States. But I wouldn't say that Luther is either practically Catholic or that, I wouldn't say that he's absolutely the same as, any kind of Protestant walking around today, on the other hand, because he would have thought that, for instance, he would have thought Baptists were, like, he would have had a lot more hope for Roman Catholics than for Baptists, which is tough, because I grew up Baptist, and, church I go to is still Credo Baptistic. So, I love a lot of Baptists, and I have definite hope for their salvation, as I do for people in the Roman Catholic Church, because actually Luther did. I mean, he did, because you say, if you're a person who's been baptized and God has made these promises to you and you're putting your trust in those promises, then you're justified before God. And that is not the perfection of your doctrine that is what saves you. So,
and we all need to hear that, Amy, Lutherans included. So that's a good reminder. Good reminder for sure. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about, a little bit more about the book. I just, as you were talking, thought, why did you decide to even include Philip Melanchthon? Because, this is a feud between, as you've said, Luther and Erasmus. What does Melanchthon kind of bring into that argument? Why did you consider him a really important character in this book?
Yeah, because actually initially my idea was just Luther and Erasmus. And then I realized that Luther and Erasmus kind of represent these two poles. Almost, you could say, like, one is on the left and one is on the right, although they don't neatly match up with politics or theology now. But you kind of have these two opposing approaches to the world. One that's very heavy on, moral behavior, one that's very heavy on correct doctrine, one that's more conservative, more optimistic about human nature, and one that's more pessimistic. And in this story, Melanchthon kind of becomes he's in the center, kind of getting pulled in either direction. And the reality, I mean, Melanchthon is a bit of an enigma still because he didn't always say everything he was thinking. But basically, on the most important doctrines, he's in line with Luther. I mean, this is the guy who's written the confession that is used by all Lutherans today. So
Right.
I never want people to get the idea that, oh, well, he wasn't really in line with Luther on the most important things. But Melanchthon is drawn to Erasmus more as one would be like an intellectual kind of draw, because Melanchthon even had some ties with Erasmus going back, although they never met. They had a lot of the same friends. Melanchthon had been so much inspired by Erasmus's work on biblical translation and recovering the wisdom of the ancients. When Melanchthon comes to Wittenberg, it's as to teach Greek, because he's considered to be the best Greek teacher in Germany,
Yeah.
maybe in Europe. And he loves ancient literature. So he's having almost, you might say, more of a secular pull to Erasmus. There is a little bit, I mean, you could say maybe Melanchthon in the end, and there's a lot of debate over how much Melanchthon and Luther differed on the end. Maybe Melanchthon was a little more optimistic about human nature than Luther, but
Yeah.
I think he always theologically is much closer to Luther than Erasmus. It's more of a personal pull. And you'll see in this story that Luther, Melanchthon, and Erasmus all experienced some very difficult broken relationships as a result of the path they were taking. Melanchthon's great uncle, Reuchlin, had been the greatest Hebrew scholar of the day. And after Melanchthon's father and grandfather died, Reuchlin was almost like his surrogate father and organized all his education, got him that job in Wittenberg. But Reuchlin was a traditionalist. And when Melanchthon started, going for what Luther was teaching and they're working together, Reuchlin disowned him, wrote him out of the will. That's really tough. It was like this, he'd lost his dad when he was 10 and now he's lost another dad.
Yeah.
And Erasmus was the illegitimate son of a priest, so he never really had much of a relationship with his father. And that fact that he was illegitimate is going to keep haunting him for his whole life. He's trying to run away from that. And Luther's relationship with his father is incredibly heavily studied. I think at this point, people have leaned into that too much. He didn't hate his father and his father didn't hate him. And their relationship improved as the years went by. But so I think people read a little too much into that. But the other interesting thing with Luther is when he was a monk and experiencing such serious depressions, his confessor was Johann von Staupitz, who was the head of his order, the vicar general of the Augustinians. And basically, Staupitz puts him on the theological path that eventually leads Luther into a lot of his theological discoveries, only Staupitz kind of stops short. He's not willing to step away from the church. And in 1518, about a year after the 95 Theses have been nailed, Luther gets called down to Augsburg to be questioned and to ask if he's willing to recant what he's teaching. And Staupitz is with him. And at that meeting, Staupitz releases Luther from his monastic vows. And a lot of people have seen this as a very kind, loving thing that Staupitz did because he's trying to protect Luther. He's trying to protect him from being targeted for excommunication. I don't think that's how it felt to Luther. I think that he felt like a father figure was disowning him again.
That's really interesting.
And if you look at the letters that Luther wrote to Staupitz in the following years, Staupitz went on to take a very cushy job as an abbot in Salzburg, where he was, at the end, basically he forsook all that theological stuff he was doing and just lived richly for the last couple of years of his life. And Luther absolutely felt betrayed by him. And he's the last couple of years, Staupitz is, as my book opens up, Staupitz is not doing well. He's on his last year of life. And Luther is writing to him, trying to reconcile, and Staupitz is not even writing back at that point.
Oh,
and so each of these people had incredibly painful broken relationships. And here I
Hmm.
am living in this time where pretty much everyone in American Christianity is saying that because of the political controversies, they have had broken relationships. But also, I had, as I was getting ready to write, I had experienced some broken friendships in my own life.
Hmm.
Nothing terribly dramatic, things that I hope will someday be healed. But,
Yeah.
just the kind of feeling of you get old enough, this happens. And
Right.
it's
Exactly.
tough. You realize there are multiple ways to lose people. You can lose people to death, or you can lose them because they're just not interested in talking to you anymore.
Yeah.
And so I thought by bringing Melanchthon in, it could show what it's like to be torn between two different things and
Hmm.
the uncertainty that creates. And certainty and assurance are a big theme of this book. So we're
Yeah.
seeing, I think for me, Melanchthon is kind of how I feel a lot of times in my life, because I'm a person who wants to please everyone most of the time to a point. I'm willing to take a stand on things that are really important, but I'm not jumping into conflicts all the time.
Right.
So I understand, kind of the trying to please one person you love and another person that you love, and the difficulty of that. And I think that really what I get down to at a point in my book is saying that at a certain point, everybody, just because we're human and we're fallible and we can be affected by depression or anxiety or life circumstance, I mean, sickness, so many things can we can have these firmly held principles, but at a certain point, we can become so overwhelmed that we're actually not capable ourselves of standing on those principles. And that is
Hmm.
when our human limitation is revealed. And that's precisely when we see that God is holding us.
Hmm.
And this gets to a biblical image that really inspired me quite a bit, which is Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
Genesis. And the whole night he's struggling with this guy who he doesn't realize is, this divine, possibly manifestation of Christ. And
Mm-hmm.
at the end, it seems like he's overcome his opponent. And then his opponent just lightly touches him. And all of a sudden, it just reveals that Jacob's been completely impotent this whole time. Like,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
thought he was so powerful at doing all this.
Right.
And that it just reveals, no, actually, you don't have any power at all.
You
And
have none. It was a facade.
as I was beginning to research this book, I read this work that was sort of comparing, looking at this theology of struggle and what Luther called his Anfechtungen in
Mm-hmm.
his theology, which is kind of like a trial or a temptation. And that author mentioned a sculpture that was done by a British artist whose name I honestly forget, called Jake, that is of Jacob and the angel. And it's unlike any depiction of the story I've ever seen. The angel is
Hmm.
just holding Jacob. Jacob's completely limp, and the angel's just
Hmm.
holding him. And what this is supposed to reveal is this whole time when we thought we were doing all these things, actually, when we thought we were holding on so tightly, God was holding us that whole time.
Yeah.
And I came to see that sculpture is what that episode looked like from God's perspective.
Hmm.
And I think when we go through these trials of faith and we experience doubts and uncertainties, we're like Jacob, wrestling through the night, just beating on God and taking our questions to him like Job did. And we're angry. And you know what? That's okay. God
Right.
actually wants you to wrestle with him.
Hmm.
Because what's worse than taking your doubts and your questions to God is not taking your doubts and your questions to God.
Hmm.
Because then just saying, oh, I'll just go figure this out on my own,
Yeah.
or, God wants you to take all that to him. But then at the end of the day, it ends in this just realizing that you have to accept there are some things you're never going to be able to understand. But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that God can take whatever you throw at him. That's what we see from David in the Psalms. That's what we see so often in scripture. And at the end of the day, no matter how you've behaved, God is faithful to you, even when
Yeah.
you cannot sustain your own faith.
And
And
that is
so,
and
yeah.
that is the revelatory truth of God through Christ.
Mhm.
Like I think that I don't know, and I don't want to oversimplify. For me, a lot of times struggles of doubt or uncertainty are kind of like, it seems like they're trying to push that fact aside. Like, I'm like, yeah, I know that. But like, what about all of these things? And yet at the end of the day, like once that struggle is over, whatever that looks like, however long that period lasts, or, if it manifests through relationships or whatever, what I'm brought back to is that fact that I am trying to run away from, and I think is the thing that is holding us, and that's the fact that Christ has died for us on the cross. It's the gospel. But it is. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I think it's, for whatever reason, we do want to push that aside and even belittle it, and yet in faith, we're always brought back to the fact that that's like what we're cradled in. And I don't know if that makes any sense. That just is what came to mind as you were talking.
Yeah, no. And, Luther was so fascinated by the incarnation for his whole career, and the fact that Christ actually takes on our flesh and becomes human. And you could say that he took on human flesh so that we wouldn't be struggling alone, so that he kind of descends into that hell for us. But this is the key thing, because nowadays you'll hear some people that will talk about that. Oh, Christ is an ally of people who have suffered injustice because he suffers alongside them. It's not enough for Christ to suffer alongside you. He suffered in our place.
Yeah.
The important thing about Christ is not just that he is taking on, our hurts and our pains. It's that he's actually doing something that's going to bring an end to them.
Yeah.
And, I think all this gets back to this concept that Christian life is really, putting your faith in a promise that God's given you. And that promise is that he's going to, even as he's raised you spiritually, he's going to raise you physically from the dead. When Christ came to earth, when he died on the cross, it seemed, for all intents and purposes, that God's promise to send a deliverer that was going to, provide this substitutionary atonement. When Christ dies, it seems like, just a travesty, and the ultimate evil. It seems like, basically that there's no reason to keep having faith, because what can you have faith in? Christ is dead. And that's how the disciples felt. They all went and hid in a room because essentially their faith was dead, everything that they put faith in. But then what happens is that when the resurrection happens, that is the paradigm shift. It's the deliverance that we couldn't possibly get to with our reason. We couldn't possibly get there. It is the resurrection of, when Christ is resurrected, it's a resurrection of their faith. It's giving their faith substance. They have something to put their hope in, because now we see what the cross means now that we have the resurrection.
Yeah, I was going to say it transforms the cross completely.
Yes, absolutely. And Luther would always say the cross alone is our theology. And I knew what he meant by that, so I'm not opposing it. But honestly, if you have the cross alone without the resurrection, it's just bad news. Right. And there would be no reason at all to believe in a God who would send his son to die just for kicks and giggles. And sometimes you'll hear this, so that people will talk about, oh, it would be cruel that God would send his son to die on the cross to take on the sins of sinners. That's just cruel. I think it would be cruel if he sent his son to die on a cross for any other reason than to take on the sins of sinners. Yeah. If it was just to show, oh, I love you a lot, there must have been some other way to do that than, the evil of making the only innocent person who's ever lived suffer the death of a guilty person. The only thing that justifies the cross is the resurrection. And that's why Christ went to the cross and laid his life down, because he said ahead of time, I'm laying my life down to take it back up again. And when God resurrects Christ, that is how he becomes, he's, as Paul says, he's just and the justifier. God himself is just in everything he's doing. And that is why he can justify us by giving us the righteousness of Christ, by Christ taking on our sins, by this exchange that takes place. So
amazing.
yeah.
Well, okay, so you've talked a little bit about relating to Melanchthon. Would you say he is the character you relate most to personally, or is there someone else?
Thank you for asking me that, because I was wondering when someone was going to ask me who I identify with the most.
Yeah.
So I see a little bit of myself in all the characters, but if you had to ask me, I feel like I'm Melanchthon. And I don't say that because I'm so intelligent, but because of now that I've explained you the role he plays in the book, I feel like I'm the person who, if you follow his trajectory in the book, that's kind of the journey I feel like I've been on. And even when it gets to, how his story kind of hits the apex at the end of book 2. And originally it was going to be each book would begin and end with a Melanchthon scene. And then as I went along, I decided to add a prologue to both books, and the prologue was Luther in both cases. So now, it's just inevitable that everyone talks to me about them as the Luther novels, and, most wants to focus on Luther. But to me, even though all 3 of them, I love them all. They're around this time, Luther made the joke that he had 3 wives, and they were the 3 nuns that he was trying to find homes for. Well, I won't say as I wrote this that I had 3 husbands, but maybe 3 brothers in Christ. That sounds less scandalous.
Yeah.
So, and I do love them all as brothers, but I think I identify with Melanchthon the most.
Okay.
If I'm being honest.
Can you kind of, as we get close to the end of our time, can you give us a little bit, because I feel like we maybe jumped ahead of this, give us like a picture of what the first book kind of goes through? I mean, we know we know it's this debate between Luther and Erasmus, but what's happening exactly? And then can you talk a little bit, because I don't think you just mentioned it, but we haven't really touched on it yet, the fact that this is the first part, Broken Bonds is the first part of a 2-part series. So talk to us a little bit about them as a grouping, and then just the first book that's coming out soon.
Yeah, well, I decided I wasn't going to release a fat book again. So we've got 2 books. Originally, I thought it'd be 1 book, and then I got by halfway through, and I knew how many scenes, I had my scenes all planned out, and I knew how many words I needed to average per scene to get to my desired word count at the end. And I could tell, despite my efforts, I was way ahead of the word count. So I said, okay, it's going to be 2 books. And it works. I think it works very well as 2 books, actually. Maybe better than it would have as 1 book. But what's going on, Kelsi, is that society's falling apart. We're now several years, about 7 years after Luther has nailed the 95 Theses to the door. So a lot has happened, and we now have gone on long enough that it's not just Luther's ideas that are out there, but a lot of other ideas have been popping up. Now that the genie's out of the bottle, we have all kinds of theological movements starting, specifically, 2 that people still know today, the Reformed movement and the Anabaptist movement.
Yeah.
And then some stuff that's so crazy, I won't even call it Anabaptist, because that would be an insult to Anabaptists. So this is another reason I wanted to write this story, because I feel like this historical moment is very similar to ours. We have major political polarization. We have rapidly changing notions of sex and gender, because, of course, Luther's going to come out and say celibacy is not superior to getting married and having a family. And he's going to say that clergy can get married. So that's a big sea change. And of course, right now we're seeing a big sea change. And you start to see it in book 1, but really in book 2, I talk about the characters encountering the German peasant uprising, rebellion, war. It has different names. But basically, this was the largest popular uprising in Europe prior to the French Revolution. Possibly 100,000 people were killed in Germany. I mean, it was just incredible. And it was mostly, of course, any revolution always has multiple people trying to get in and take over leadership and direct it to their own ends. but mostly it's people from the lower rungs of society banding together with what limited means and weaponry they have, and they don't have
Right.
any military training, and they're going to try to go out and just, they're settling scores with all the lords who have cheated them and everything. But when it gets into its last, final, most violent phase, it is Thomas Müntzer, who is a theologian who had passed through Wittenberg, but was always way more radical than Luther. And
Yeah.
it's like an end times cult. He's telling them, just sell everything. We're going to go out and,
it's crazy.
We're going to bring about this glorious victory, and we'll all become basically communist, and that Jesus is going to come back. And I say communist. It wasn't exactly communism, but that didn't keep the East Germans during the Cold War from thinking that Müntzer had been one of their predecessors. So he's going to lead all these not very well-armed people out onto a field of battle where they're going to encounter knights on horseback and cannons and all kinds of things like that. And I mean, it's what you think would happen. It's a bloodbath. And to Luther, a lot of people have given Luther a very hard time over this because he writes this pamphlet against the robbing and murderous hordes of peasants. And I think it's because people it's hard to understand Luther's perspective on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
He does not just see these people as people with a different theological view or just as peasants with some grievances. Because earlier on, when it had really just been some peasants with grievances, he had written some stuff that was much more positive and saying, yeah, peasants have been badly treated. But by the end, what it has become is basically it's an insurrection or a coup attempt. They're trying to bring down the government. And it has become very anarchic, and people are just kind of getting slaughtered. And that is what you need to think of as the context in which he wrote that. And he's really saying what people shouldn't be doing is violently overthrowing the government.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
I'm not saying I entirely defend the way he worded everything, but I actually think when I read what he wrote, most of his reasoning is sound, and we would still use it today.
For sure.
He goes to some excesses in his verbiage, but the basic reasoning, I mean, yeah, we're not going to be okay with an armed militia group just taking over our government. That's not okay. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's all going on. At the same time that this literary debate is happening.
Yeah,
there's crazy.
The debate it seems like the debate is the central, narrative story, but in a way you're able to get at all of these other Reformation happenings going on because because the debate comes at such a pivotal moment in 1524 and 1525, right?
Yeah. And and by the way, this is also the time that Luther gets married, so that's happening too.
Awesome.
But really, in terms of God's sovereignty, there are two different aspects that the book explores. Of course, it's looking at his sovereignty over salvation, but it's also looking at God's sovereignty over history. And when everything seems chaotic and you're just terrified by world events, understanding that God is sovereign over history too. And I really felt that in my bones as I was writing, because just as I was starting out, Russia invaded Ukraine. We'd just come off the COVID pandemic. We were having, economic issues. Everything's going right. And now, this year with the election, a lot of people feel the same way. So I think it's a great time to look back at how people in a similar situation in the past dealt with how they felt as Christians and how they were able to trust in or not trust in God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
So,
really, I mean, a huge tie, just to add one more thing in, obviously, between our two time periods is this explosion of information. I mean, because really one of the main reasons the Reformation happened is because of the printing press and the fact that Luther could get all of this information out so quickly. And here we are again, we've had the internet for a long time now, but it's changing. Everything is changing rapidly. We're just so inundated with information. And I don't think we've been able to catch up to what that means. on an individual, like psychological level. So yeah,
Yeah.
we're
We're
in
still
that
trying to
explosion again.
decide. We're still trying to decide what the internet should be, really. We're still
Yeah.
having a lot of the preliminary debates over
Mm-hmm.
social media rules and things like that. But yeah, and I always tell people, if you think things are nasty in social media now, my goodness, you should read the stuff they were writing in the 16th century.
Yeah.
Technology changes, but human beings don't
Do
change
not.
in our
Do
most
not.
basic desires and behaviors. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Amy, this has been so great. I wish we could talk more, because I feel like we could talk for hours about this book and your work. And I'm just so grateful for all of your writing at 1517. If people have not read what you've written for 1517 yet, they need to check it out, because you are one of our most consistent writers and thoughtful writers right now, and have just done such an amazing job tackling both theological topics as well as historical topics for us. So I'm grateful for your work and really excited for people to read this novel. Tell us, this is probably going to come out after the release of the novel, but tell us again the name and the release date, and I will of course make sure to link it in the show notes.
Yeah. So it's interesting because the name is Broken Bonds, a novel of the Reformation, coming out. The release date is November 12th. Now, we have had a delay with shipping the books. So if you've put in a pre-order for the papers, all the orders are going to be honored. It's just, it might be a couple weeks late. If you order a digital copy, I think you're still going to get it right on the release date. So the release date, November 12th, and you can go to the 1517 shop or to Amazon and put in your order for it and pre-order, and it will come to your house or your device, whichever you choose. And then late next year sometime, around the same time of the year, I think they'll bring out the second one.
Okay.
So
perfect. That's awesome. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much, Kelsi. I love talking to you.
Outside Ourselves is 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcast. We are in the middle of December right now. Make sure that you check out the 1517 website for the tail end of our Advent resources as well as our Christmas resources. I hope that you and your family are having a Merry Christmas season, and that the reminder that Christ has died for you, that he came to this earth to live, to die, and to rise for us, is ever present with you throughout these days. I'll see you back here in a couple weeks, maybe more than that, depending on how the holidays go, with our next guest.